Three things about Ian Angus. He runs a blues show on a Toronto radio station, CIUT. He is a telecommunications consultant. I never quite know what that means to someone as a consultant. I suspect they don't either. But I was going to suggest that if you wanted to find out, you could go to his website, which is www.angustel.ca. Perhaps you would find out there. And thirdly, Ian told me of this very nice little coincidence that once took place in his life in relation to this book. In 1982, on one particular day, the Globe and Mail ran a review of Canadian Bolsheviks in its book section. So, Canadian Bolsheviks by Ian Angus. The same day, on the front page of the report on business, Ian was quoted as part of a story having to do with Bell Canada. And only one person of his acquaintance put that together, somebody in the labour movement who said, "Was that you there?" So he's a man of many, many sides, I think. Ian claims that for the past 2 decades he has not been active in politics, although he retains a strong interest in the communist movement, its goals, its history, its strategies, both internationally and in Canada. He has, however, got running a major online activity, the Socialist History Project. If you haven't looked at that, I would encourage you to do so. It's an amazing work in progress. And he has revised this book, or revised it and sort of freshened it up, I guess you could say. Maybe he'll talk a bit about what he's actually done to it. In my book, all that counts as political activity, very much so. And I think, as all the responders have made clear, it's very important political activity. So please welcome Ian Angus.
I hope somebody's made arrangements to widen the top of the door so I'll be able to get out. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks to the other speakers. That was really great. And thank you. I will tell you that we have about twice as many people here as were at the launch meeting that we held for this book in Vancouver in 1982, which is a good sign, a very good sign. Another good sign, I will say, is that in 1982, the number of sponsors of the meeting was 1. This time, we've got a wide range of sponsors for people who probably don't normally speak to each other very much, except, yelling. And it's just really great to see, people. My basic view is that the way the left will ultimately be built in this country is not by getting into debating points about who said what during the Cochrane split, or whatever other obscure thing you want to argue about, but by actually doing things together. And it's that process of actually working together on common projects that I think will get us to understand the areas where we actually do have a lot in common. That's not to denigrate or to downplay the differences. They are significant and they should be talked out and worked out, but those differences shouldn't prevent us from working together on the things we agree on. And if this meeting does even a little bit towards that, I'm going to be really pleased. I started out with a really clever opening here about how historians are all academics, and then everybody else used it. I have this thing that Canadian history books are all either written by university professors or Pierre Burton. And Canadian Bolsheviks is kind of an exception to that process because I am not and was not an academic. When I wrote Canadian Bolsheviks, I was working full-time for Bell Canada. And it was written and researched during lunch hours and evenings and weekends and on my vacation. It was edited, proofread, typeset entirely by volunteers. And it was published with the support of a memorial fund that was set up to honor Reg Bullock, who a name I'm sure many of you know, longtime leader of the Revolutionary Socialist Movement here in Vancouver, who died in 1979, just before the book was completed. And at the memorial meeting for him, the fund was set up, and that's what made it possible to publish a book independently and to sort of toss it into the broad conversation. I think when it first came out, it was a lot of the academic world had trouble with it because it didn't come out of proper origins, but I'm pleased to say over the years it has been well accepted. And not only in the academic world, which, by the way, was a surprise to me because although I've been doing things in relation to politics, like not in active politics, I really sort of had not been following academic history for many, many years. And it was a surprise to me the number of people who put it in footnotes, either to agree with it or disagree with it, or to extend it. And certainly there are things that have the research that's been done since I did the book that extends a great deal of what I've got in there. I don't think there's much that really contradicts it. Anyway, as people have said, it's been out of print for several years now. So the Socialist History Project decided to republish it, and we did it in association with Trafford Publishing in Victoria, who bear no responsibility whatsoever for its content and would be outraged if I suggested that they do. But what they do have is some very remarkable technology that lets them do publishing on demand, which means basically this book doesn't exist in a inventory in a warehouse somewhere. It exists in a computer. And they literally print them as they get orders. And the technology exists. So that means it can stay in print for a long time. I'm pretty pleased about that. As long as, the computer doesn't crash. And we know that never happens. 83 years ago in this country, something quite remarkable happened. The Canadian left, which was fragmented, it was broken into different groups. They were squabbling among each other. They didn't like each other very much. Came together and created a new party. And the people who came together represented, you can't get numbers, but my guess would be something of the order of 80% of the organized left in Canada came together in a new organization. It called itself the Communist Party of Canada. It called itself the Workers' Party of Canada as its public name for a few years. And in its first decade, this organization did astonishing things. It led strikes in a period when the labor movement was in the deepest decline we have seen in 100 years. I'll talk about some of the other things it did in a minute. Just did some astounding things during the 1920s. And yet, one of the things that got me into writing this book was the realization that that first decade was virtually forgotten. In fact, I set about to write the book. Really, I didn't set out to write a book. I set out to write a pamphlet. And the pamphlet was going to try and answer one question. And it's not a short question, but it's going to be expressed this way. If in 1922 you had gone to any politically aware worker in Canada and said, who's in the Communist Party and what do they do? They would have said, well, there's Jack MacDonald and Morris Spector and Mike Buey and Bill Moriarty and Florence Custance. Those would have been the most likely names they would have mentioned. And what does it do? Well, it's a big organizer, active in the unions. It's got a women's movement. It's working jointly with the Social Democrats, who they disagreed with, in the Canadian Labour Party, and running joint candidates so that there would only be one left-wing candidate in elections. Now, if you'd gone back to that same worker or somebody like him in 1931 or 32 and said, who's in the Communist Party and what does it do? First of all, not one of those names would have been mentioned because none of them were in the party anymore. They would have said, well, there's Tim Buck. He's the main guy. And they might mention Stuart Smith if they knew enough about things, maybe Sam Carr. And what does the party do? Well, they've left all those unions that they were in, and they won't work with anybody. The Social Democrats that they used to work with, they now call social fascists. And the party's changed a fair bit. And so the question I really wanted to ask, in a certain sense, was, I was starting out to ask the question, what happened? But the question got out of hand as I did the research, as I realized you couldn't answer that without looking really at what this party was really like and where it came from, because it was amazing. And the problem here was that for most of the 20th century, this has improved lately, but certainly at the time I was writing and on, the history of labor in Canada has sort of been written from one of two viewpoints. Either the viewpoint of the social democracy, the CCF-NDP current, or from the viewpoint of the Communist Party. Those have been the two main sources of historical writing until fairly recently. And both of those currents had a really strong reason for not talking about the 1920s. For the Social Democrats, they've treated the rise of the Communist Party as an aberration. Obviously, Marxism is alien to Canadian life. That's a given, right? Obviously, social democracy and the British Labour Party tradition is what's natural and really Canadian. So a period when the dominant party on the left, by an extraordinary margin, viewed itself as a revolutionary Marxist organization, there had to have been something wrong about that.